Hello, in this video I actually want to ask a serious question, and that is, should we compare Christianity with communism? I actually heard many leftist commentators make this comparison, but they often use it as a joke. They'll say something like Christianity was just an ancient form of communism, and they'll do it as a joke in order to provoke conservatives or Christians. But I actually think that there is a lot of truth to this idea that Christianity and communism are very similar in many ways, and that their histories are in fact also very similar. And Yuval Noah Harari actually makes the case that the very same comparison can be made between communism and Islam and communism and Buddhism, and I might do a separate video where I compare the spread of communism with the spread of Islam and Buddhism. But in this video I will focus on Christianity. Well, both ideologies, both communism and Christianity, actually start as philosophies advocated by two pretty strange guys, and for a long time both ideologies, while popular with both the masses and with the intellectuals of their time, they are not truly a relevant player on the world stage. And in both cases very few people would have guessed how impactful both ideologies would be in the next centuries. Very few people would have guessed in the first century that Christianity will take over the world, in the same way in which very few people would have guessed that China and the Soviet Union would become communist, and that they would later spread that ideology to Africa, and almost all the anti-colonial movements in the world would become communist. And there is another similarity made by the German historian Max Beer, and that is that there cannot be any doubt that common possessions were looked upon by many of the first Christians as an ideal to be aimed at. And also in the Acts of the Apostles it is said that the first Christians had all things in common. So both ideologies actually emphasized the importance of collectivism and wealth redistribution. But the similarities actually don't end here. Both ideologies thrived in chaos. For the communists, that was the chaos of the First World War, in which the Russian Empire armed its people and sent them to die as cannon meat on the battlefield. And it is not that surprising that there was a revolution after that move was made. But for Christianity it may not be as obvious to you why Christianity profited from the turbulent period of the 3rd century in Rome, that is also known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Well, most pagan temples and religions were dependent upon rich donors to survive, and many of those rich donors went bankrupt or just died either from the war and from the plague. But Christianity survived because many little people, average ordinary people, were donating money to the Christian church. And the reason for that is that in the 3rd century the Christians introduce a new rule, and that is that you can give money as a sign of repentance to the church. And in fact many Christians do it, and the Christian church decides then to use that money in order to help widows and orphans. And by doing it they actually gain a lot of support even with the pagans, in the same way in which, for example, in China and in Cuba the communists gained a lot of popularity with the people when they decided to steal cattle from the rich and give it to the poor. And there was even a character that's in Chinese historiography called the Chinese Robin Hood, Liu Chitan, who precisely became popular through stealing food from the rich and giving it to the poor that were starving, just like the early Christians did. And unfortunately Liu Chitan was later killed by Mao Zedong because he was too popular, and Mao feared that the Red Army might support him instead of Mao Zedong. And what also needs to be said is that while the Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, it is a myth that they were constantly persecuted before they came to power. The first persecution of Christians that happened in the entire empire at once happened in 250. So for 250 years the Christians weren't actually persecuted in the entire empire at once. And it is also a kind of bizarre that precisely because they were persecuted, the Christians were forced to leave the local areas in which they found themselves and go to other areas, and that way Christianity spread throughout the empire. And in the same way, the communists were also often helped by the fact that they were forced to remain underground and hidden, even in most liberal countries, because they were persecuted, which is why when the fascists attacked Eastern Europe, we can go with the example of Yugoslavia, the communists already had a pretty good underground movement that was good at distributing weapons and starting diversions, while the liberals had no experience in fighting a guerrilla warfare against the fascists, or in case of China, against the Japanese. The communists were already skilled in fighting a guerrilla war when the Japanese conquered China, while Chiang Kai-shek obviously wasn't. So both ideologies are helped by the fact that for a long time they are actually persecuted. But as I already said, up until the year 303, when Emperor Diocletian starts with the great persecution of Christians, actually Christians aren't really persecuted in a way in which they later persecute the pagans. And that is also one similarity that both communism and Christianity share. They both treated their political enemies far worse and killed many more of their political enemies than their enemies killed of them while they still weren't in power. The fact that best illustrates this is that both Stalin and Lenin went to prison for their anti-Russian empire activities, and they weren't killed, but Stalin later killed millions of his men simply because he suspected that they might be doing something against the Soviet state, while on the other hand he was convicted and there was actually hard evidence that indicated that he was a communist, but he still wasn't killed. And later the Christians killed their pagan enemies at a much higher rate than the pagans killed them in the Roman Empire. And for a long time it was only the Christian priests that were persecuted, and not ordinary Christians that just wanted to worship their God in their homes. And one other myth that exists about Christianity is that it was a religion for only poor people and slaves, where many members of the elite were also Christians, in the same way in which many rich intellectuals were also communists, just like many on the bottom of the social hierarchy were also communists and Christians, because those at the bottom of the hierarchy liked the idea of wealth redistribution that's present in both ideologies, while the intellectuals often liked the idea of universal brotherhood that is present in both ideologies. And Julius Africanus is an example of a great Roman intellectual that was a Christian. Then there was the famous concubine of the Emperor Commodus, Marcia. She was also Christian, and she was obviously in a very elitist and a powerful position. And one other asset that both communists and Christians had is that they aimed at conquering all the world. They aimed at converting all the world to their ideology, while many other ideologies and religions were actually only aimed at a very narrow demographic. For example, the cult of Mithras, the cult of the invincible sun, was a religion of the legions, of the soldiers in the Roman Empire. And that's why women usually didn't worship Mithra or the invincible sun. And there were other gods that were only worshipped by women and not by men that wanted to kind of be cool and macho, which is why they worshipped Mithra. But Christianity, on the other hand, said Jesus died for all of us, whether you're a man or woman, black or white, Roman or a barbarian, which was a very radical statement at that point in time. And both communism and Christianity greatly profited from that radical idea. In communism, that idea can be described by by that famous Marx quote, "Workers of all nations unite." While in Christianity, that is the idea that we are all created in the image of Christ. And yeah, that is also one of the reasons for the popularity of both ideologies. They were both first that made this radical statement that no, in fact, humans are equal. In the case of communism, that was made against racist systems that were implemented by the liberals in the colonies and against what the fascists did in their own countries. So the anti-racist aspect of communism is what made it popular in Africa and Asia, while what made communism popular with the barbarians is also this idea that unity in Christ is much greater than disunity between the Romans and the barbarians that existed at the time. And Emperor Diocletian was actually the first Roman empire that started to persecute the Christians on a large scale, and that is why we are talking about a period that's called the Great Persecution of Christians, that happens in the early 4th century. And his reasons for disliking Christianity were numerous. First of all, he wanted to restore the ancient Roman traditions and religion in order to unify the empire, which is why he called himself Jovius, which means Jupiter. And he was very angered by the fact that many Christian priests refused to sacrifice animals to Jupiter after his great victory against the Persians. Then the fact that Christianity was a pacifist religion made many Christians refuse to serve in the military, which simply wasn't acceptable. And of course, what I already said, this idea that both Romans and barbarians should forget their differences and be united in Christ, also wasn't popular with the emperor, that believed that Romans are far more superior to the barbarians. He disliked this idea of universal brotherhood of all men as a, let's say, a Roman patriot, and maybe we can even use the word a proto-nationalist of sorts. And so he started to persecute the Christians, crucify them, kill them, throw them to the lands, and after a period of 11 years of great persecution, Constantine the Great comes to power and he ends the persecution and in fact starts to help the church and spread Christianity. And there are also many examples of the communists being greatly persecuted and killed. For example, here we can see the Paris Commune, the communists in the Paris Commune getting killed, and there is a great movie that depicts the genocide of Chinese people in Indonesia, and the Chinese were accused of being communists, which is why they were killed in large numbers in Indonesia during the 1960s, and a few million of them in fact got slaughtered. So there are some examples of both communists and Christians getting slaughtered on a massive scale by their enemies. For example, what happened in Indonesia, or what some Islamic countries are doing to Christians, like ISIS or Boko Haram in Africa. But what I said earlier remains to be true, and that is that both Christians and communists killed more of their own people than their enemies ever did. If we just look at Mao's Great Leap Forward, we can see the number of 38 million dead Chinese people, which is something that even the Japanese never managed to do. And if we look at all the wars between the Christians, whether we are talking about the crusade against the heretics or about the 30 Years' War, it also becomes obvious that Christians killed themselves at a far higher rate than the Muslims ever did. And how the Christians dealt with pagan monuments reminds me of what Mao Zedong did during the cultural revolution. In both ideologies, there was this radical idea of creating a new world was present, and both ideologies aimed at creating a new world and destroying all tradition, which is why a great temple of god Serapis was destroyed in ancient Egypt. The Greco-Roman deity of Serapis was seen as a false god, and therefore one of the most beautiful statues and monuments in Egypt was destroyed by the 4th century Christians, in the same way in which Mao Zedong destroyed some of the most beautiful Chinese cultural monuments, because they represented the old system, the old world, and both Christianity and communism now aimed at creating a new world. And here we can see the massacre that occurred at the day of Saint Bartholomew in France, when the Catholics started to massacre the Protestants. And some estimates say that between 10,000 and 30,000 Christians were killed on that day. And try for a moment and guess how many Christians were killed in the Roman Empire in 300 years of anti-Christian persecution. Yuval Noah Harari says even if we take a maximalist approach, we are talking about 10,000 Christians. So this only shows to illustrate my previous point about communists and Christians being far more talented at killing each other than their opposition. And here we can see the crusades that were launched against heretics, and Christian heretics were actually killed at a much higher rate than Christians in Muslim countries that often weren't killed at all, but were killed only when they demanded lower taxation. And here we can see a Soviet military invading Prague and crushing the Prague Spring, one of the most tragic events in the history of communism that actually illustrated how the communists' ideas of universal brotherhood and unity were forgotten by the Soviets. And this image illustrates Soviet imperialism very well. And what's also tragic about it is that Dubček, the General Secretary of Czechoslovakia, didn't even want to abolish communism. All he wanted was a liberal version of communism that combines communism and free speech. But Dubček couldn't allow, but Brezhnev couldn't allow such thing to exist, which is why he crushed it with violence. In the same way in which the early heresies, early Christian heresies were crushed after Constantine the Great came to power in Rome. Which brings me to the Bell of the Milvian Bridge, which was a remarkable event in which Constantine, with his Christian legions, faced against his arch nemesis Maxentius, who brought his pagan legions to the battlefield, and the armies met at the Milvian Bridge, and Constantine, being a military genius, managed to lure his enemy into attacking him and then kill him and massacre his troops. And Actually, people forget, but Christianity came to power in the Roman Empire, one could say by violent means, if we count the Battle of the Milvian Bridge as a battle that made Roman Empire a Christian empire, because Constantine started to Christianize the empire after that famous battle, and in the same way the communists managed to win against a much larger and a more numerous enemy due to their tactical brilliance that was displayed by Trotsky and Lenin in the Red Army during the Civil War. And Constantine allegedly saw a cross of light in the sky, which is why he made a bargain with the Christian god. A day before the battle, he promised to Christianize the empire if he is granted victory, and we know what happened. He won. And in the same way that very soon after communists came to power, they started to massacre the heretics. The Arian heresy was particularly dangerous in the eyes of Constantine the Great, and Arius, the Christian priest, claimed that the essence of the Father and the essence of the Son are not the same, which is why Constantine decided to wipe out this early heresy and unite Christianity in very much the same way in which Trotskyites got slaughtered by Stalinists. And the irony remains is that both movements, both the Arian heresy and Trotskyism, while they did lose the battle, in the end they remained very influential for a very long time. Constantine's own son joined the Arian heresy in the same way in which some of the most influential communist intellectuals sympathized with Trotskyism. George Orwell, for example, and Isaac Deutscher, one of the greatest historians on communism that I've read personally. And here we can see how in the Vatican this triumph of Christianity over paganism is portrayed in a very megalomaniac way. And that actually reminds me of the communist monuments that were built by the Soviets after they won the war. And now that I've laid out some of the most important similarities between the two ideologies, I also want to emphasize one pretty important difference. And you all probably know about the fact that communism is anti-religion and that it denies the supernatural, so I don't have to explain that, but there is a pretty important difference between how communists and Christians view wealth redistribution. One famous communist historian was kind of offended by this proposition that communism is just a new form of Christianity, or that Christianity is an ancient form of communism, which is why he said, well, when the Christians speak of wealth redistribution, they just say to the rich, you should give to the poor because you will be rewarded in the afterlife, and the Christians hope that the rich will find enough kindness and empathy in their hearts and that they will redistribute their wealth voluntarily. But the communists say, no, we will take away your money from you and give it to the poor. So many communists actually saw Christianity as liberal and weak, which is why they were offended by this proposition that Christianity is an ancient form of communism, in the same way in which I would imagine many Christians are also offended by this comparison that is often made by people in the modern world. But okay, that's all for this video, and see you in the next one.